Now let's talk about troubleshooting. We just went over how to test the system, including a thorough inspection. I can't overemphasize how important testing and inspection are to troubleshooting. The simple fact is that a 1-hour job can turn into an 8-hour job if you miss an important piece of information and go in the wrong direction. So get the facts first. Once you get the facts, they'll lead you to a possible source of the problem. I emphasize possible. You usually need to do some more checking to eliminate possibilities until you have only one cause left. Let's start with a review now of what the problems are that you'll most likely come up against, and rank them in the order of how common they are. The primary cause of air conditioning failure are the simple things, like a loose compressor belt or a condenser blocked with leaves or bugs. Lack of preventive maintenance follows closely. It usually shows up as a low charge of refrigerant. The third most likely problem will be a simple electrical failure, a loose connector, bad switch, or a blown fuse. And the fourth biggest cause of failure is contamination caused by water in the system. It usually shows up as an expansion valve plugged with ice crystals. And I'm sorry to say the biggest cause is the person who worked on the system last. Failure to replace that receiver dryer when you evacuate the system is just asking for trouble. And not pumping the system down for long enough to pull all the water out, that's trouble too. If both happen, well, the next mechanic down the road will be working on the system again. Parts that move are the fifth largest contribution to system failure. The compressor and blower motors are the most likely in this category. The other category includes rare problems like expansion valve failure, pressure or freeze switch failure, and even evaporators plugged with pet hair. We'll focus our troubleshooting techniques on using the information that we got from the inspection, operation test, and what the driver told us. If the problem was a simple one that we caught during our inspection, like a loose compressor belt or blocked condenser, the problem is most likely solved. Always check your work, though, with an operational test. We'll start with one of the most common problems, low R134A. Make sure you check your thermometer outside the cab before you check the gauge pressures with the maintenance manual table. This one reads 72 degrees Fahrenheit. Remember, all gauge and temperature readings are done with the compressor on. If the system is low on R134A, both the high and low gauges should read low. Check the maintenance manual for the normal reading at 72 degrees Fahrenheit. We'll use the 70-degree line. Here's where the normal range should be at 70 degrees Fahrenheit. Again, checking the table in the manual first. In the cab, the center duct temperature normally should be about 48 degrees Fahrenheit. A look at the sight glass should show very low R134A. If the R134A is very low, you might see very close to a vacuum on the low side. Nothing in the sight glass. And the binary switch may have cut off the power to the compressor clutch to protect the compressor from running dry of oil. Remember, the compressor oil circulates with the R134A. So, is it a leak? Well, a glance at the truck service record or something the driver said might help pinpoint the problem. If the AC system has been serviced recently and or the R134A is very low, it's probably a leak. If it's been more than a year or the driver hasn't been using the AC for 3 months, it could be just a lack of service or the normal leakage around the compressor seals if the compressor's not been used. In either case, you must do a thorough leak test to do a thorough troubleshooting job. You may need to add a little R134A to get the pressure up enough for the system to run. But if there's enough pressure to run, there's usually enough R134A to find a leak. If the leak is a big one, you might find drips of PAG oil on the bottom side of the fittings. Hoses don't generally leak unless they're rubbing against a moving part. And properly attached fittings generally don't leak unless there's extreme vibration or they were improperly tightened. When the engine is running, double check for vibrating parts and hoses. There are 3 keys to tightening fittings. First, make sure it's clean. A speck of dirt or grease can distort the seal enough to leak refrigerant. 2, use the correct O-ring and always lubricate it with mineral oil before you install it. If you don't, the ring may tear when tightened. And third, tighten the fitting to the torque listed in the manual. Over-tightening may distort the O-ring seal. Under-tightening will loosen and leak. Let's take a look at a second problem. Both the high and the low gauges are reading high for the ambient temperature. The duct thermometer reads about the ambient temperature or even warmer. The sight glass is normal. And the high side hoses are hot. All the information points to heat not being dumped to the outside through the condenser. This could mean one of three causes. We'll eliminate them one by one. The obvious cause is the condenser itself. You should have discovered any blockage during the physical inspection, so it's time to take a closer look. Make sure the engine is off and the fan won't come on. Shine a flashlight through the fins and look for something blocking the flow of air, or perhaps a rock has flattened a number of the cross tubes. If the condenser checks out, start the truck and carefully feel along the hot, high side hoses. If the problem is blockage, you'll feel the hose turn cool just past the blockage. And you should also do a second check for blockage when you evacuate the system. But instead of pulling from both sides right away, start with the high side only. If the low side doesn't slowly start coming down at the same time, you can be sure there's something blocking the lines. If the hoses aren't blocked, then the most obvious cause that remains is overcharging. A truck will take between 3 and 4 pounds of refrigerant, and it will only take a half a pound of extra to overcharge. On R12 systems, you used to be able to top off a system with R12 vapor on the low side until the side glass cleared. But this won't work on an R134A system. You try that and you'll overcharge the system. The weight you dial in on the charging station is the only way to charge an R134A system. High readings could also mean that someone has mixed R12 and R134A in the system. Together, the two refrigerants create an entirely new refrigerant that only compresses at very high pressures. Since the service port quick release fittings and the tank fittings are different on the two systems, it's difficult to accidentally use the wrong refrigerant station. But if it happens, the entire system must be completely flushed before recharging. A mixture of R12 and R134A cannot be separated by the recycling process. It has to be disposed of as a hazardous waste. If your gauges read low on the high side and high on the low side, and possibly don't swing as far when the compressor cuts in and out, the compressor isn't doing its job. The duct thermometer will read from slightly higher than normal to ambient temperature. This problem can have two causes. The compressor clutch is not engaging, or the compressor itself is failing. If it's the clutch or control circuit, the problem will be obvious. And we'll cover electrical troubleshooting a bit later. But if the compressor is turning and the pressures are low, check for oil thrown on the mounting bracket and listen to the unit for unusual noise. And with the engine off, double check the belt tension. Since the compressor is an expensive item, all of these double checks will be appreciated by the truck owner. Here's another problem. Your gauge readings are high on the high side and low to very low on the low side. The duct thermometer will read just a little lower than ambient temperature. You'll notice that the compressor won't be cycling on and off like it usually does. It'll stay on. It all adds up to the R134A stopping on the low side at a blocked hose or at the expansion valve. The high side is high because the refrigerant isn't going anywhere, and the low side could even be pulling a vacuum because there's nothing to pull. A quick check of the low side hoses will tell you if there's a kink or a blocked hose. Just look for a frosty section. If this is the case, the high side will be closer to normal, but the low side will still be too low. If the hoses check out, the question is it a blocked or failed expansion valve? This problem is probably the #1 misdiagnosis in AC troubleshooting. The expansion valve is really very simple. It has one moving part controlled by the pressure in the power head. Failure of the power head will let the spring close the valve, but what's more likely is that something has blocked the orifice. Remember, it's only 15/1000ths of an inch wide. It could be dirt or another contaminant, or it could be water that has frozen into an ice crystal and blocked the orifice. That's why a check of the moisture indicator is important. If it's white, ice is a suspect. If it's pink, ice is a bigger suspect. but pink could also mean the desiccant may have broken down and added contamination. Inside the receiver dryer, the desiccant will absorb more and more water until it becomes saturated and can hold no more. If there's still more water in the system, the desiccant breaks down into tiny particles and can escape into the system, plugging the expansion valve and damaging the compressor. On older R12 systems, you used to be able to test the valve by heating and cooling the power head while it was still in place. This won't always work on an R134A system, because the R134A in the suction line will absorb the heat. The first test is to shut off the truck for about 15 minutes and let the system warm up, melting the ice crystal. And then, start the truck up with the AC on and watch the thermometer. If the temperature falls at first and then rises, ice is the problem. Another test is to check the sleeper unit. If the sleeper unit works and the cab unit doesn't, it's more likely physical plugging or a failed valve. But if both work or not work at different times, it's more likely ice crystals. Now, this test is worth the trouble because if you can pinpoint ice as the culprit, you won't have to remove the valve and test it. There's also a last resort test that could narrow down the cause of the problem. In any case, you'll have to reclaim the refrigerant to test to replace the valve, so just start the evacuation on the high side only. If the low side starts to fall as well, that means the valve is opened and ice was probably the problem. If the low side doesn't move, the valve may have failed in the closed position. Keep in mind that your customer's description of the problem could also help you confirm that ice is the problem. If your test won't confirm ice, you'll have to remove the valve and test it. Now, this test is worth it to your customer. Lots of good expansion valves get thrown away because they were simply blocked with ice or contamination. At room temperature, the valve should be open. You can blow shop air through it to check. If it's plugged, try reverse flushing it with a blast of dry nitrogen. To test the valve, spray the head with a little non-CFC cool spray to cool it. Now blow through it again. It should be shut. Warm it and then blow through it again. It should be open. If you don't have a cool spray, dip the head in a little ice water to cool it. This is a low-tech test that will tell you if the valve is working. Now, it might be working but not to spec, but that's very rare. The valve failing in the open position is another extremely rare problem that you can test by cycling it at the workbench. If the valve were to fail open, you'd see the low side reading high, but the high side reading close to normal. You'd also see sweating hoses on the low side, because the R134A would be trying to evaporate outside the flooded evaporator along the entire length of the hose. If you're working in a very humid climate, there may be a little sweating. That's natural under the conditions. Now, with a 15,000th of an inch opening, it is possible for a particle to jam the valve partway open, but that's unlikely. Another thing that you should think about whenever you open the system, like to replace a suspect expansion valve, is you replace the dryer, you evacuate, and you recharge. So if the problem originally was just water in the system, the evacuation and recharging would make the problem go away, giving the appearance that the expansion valve was the cause of the problem. So first, always do a thorough job when you evacuate a system. And second, don't be too quick to blame this simple valve for the problem. Now, let's look at a few more problems that don't show up too often, but happen every now and then. If your gauges read normal on the high side, and normal or a little low on the low side, but the duct thermometer shows just a little cooling, check to see if the compressor is running, but not cycling on and off as it should. If the pressures are normal, but the system isn't cooling the airflow from the vent, there could be three reasons. First, as we saw earlier, the water valve could be letting hot engine coolant through the heater coils. Second, the freeze switch, sometimes called the thermostat, is stuck in the closed position. It isn't opening to cut off the compressor when the evaporator starts to freeze up. If this is the case, you should notice it start to cool and then drop off. And third, the evaporator fins could be physically plugged. You can check the freezing possibility by turning the AC off and then placing the air in the recirculating mode and turning on the heat for a while, at least 5 minutes, to try and melt the ice on the evaporator. Check the drip tube for a sudden flow of water. That would mean the moisture in the air was freezing on the evaporator, forming a block of ice. You should also confirm that it is the freeze switch by an electrical test at the relay. We'll demonstrate that later. But a final check is to open the cab heater AC unit and take a look. This will allow you to check for something blocking the unit. A blocked set of fins is unusual, but it happens. If the truck is in construction, dust or concrete particles could block the fins, or if the truck has been servicing a grain elevator, cereal dust can form a kind of cream of wheat on the fins. I've even seen matted pet hair block an evaporator. If the freeze switch is bad, make sure that you place the probe exactly where the old one was and to the same depth. A probe that's out of position will not allow the coil to get cold enough, or it might allow it to freeze. And by the way, the capillary tube comes from the factory coiled, so be very careful when you straighten it. Well, those are the top air conditioning troubleshooting problems that you'll see most of the time. Remember, though, that mostly you'll find something loose, disconnected, blocked, or broken on your physical inspection. The gauge set tests will help you focus on problems within the system itself. In the next module, we'll focus on tracing down electrical problems that will shut the system down. It's time again to stop the tape and review the information on this module in the workbook. And again, review the tape if you feel you need to. When you're ready, take the test and continue with the next module.